It's hard to believe more than 2 years have passed since the dramatic moment COP26, hosted in Glasgow, came to a tearful end. The 26th conference of the parties was defined by an anticlimactic moment when the Chinese and Indians modified a non-legally binding agreement. The words in the agreement were changed from the, quote, phasing out of coal to, quote, phasing down. Anyone have thought from the tone of the room that World War III had just been declared as the hall went silent, and then the president of the conference, Alok Sharma, appeared to shed a manly tear. But it was pure theatre. Since then, China has built countless coal power stations, just this year announcing plans for another 100 of them, and it currently emits nearly a third of world emissions. So much for phasing down, let alone phasing out. And so the theatre continues, this time in Dubai, as today marks the beginning of COP28, and the hypocrisy is alive and kicking. As ever, world leaders will be pontificating in the usual style, and it will be very understandable if poor old Joe Biden falls asleep, as he did previously, and who can blame him? For this year, already protesters are calling for veganism to become enshrined in law.
Make veganism the law! Make veganism the law! Make veganism the law!
War the vegan, war the peace!
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 Well, if that ever happened, I think I might break the law. But perhaps, more importantly, the United Kingdom has defended its sending of 3 private jets to the climate conference. His Majesty, King Charles, the Prime Minister, and Lord Cameron will fly separately to the summit in Dubai. At COP26 in Glasgow, there were more than 100 private jets which flew in for the conference. And this conference is set to have the largest carbon footprint of them all so far. And your leaders are set to give £60 million of your money to climate causes. However, the Conference of the Parties is merely a symptom of a much wider problem within our society. Over the past 20 years, we've transferred sovereignty away from our democratic institutions that you vote for to unelected and unaccountable ones. Obvious examples can be found with the Bank of England or the rather arrogant Scientific Advisory Committee for Emergencies, SAGE. But climate change is perhaps the worst subject of all for this phenomenon. We have the Paris Climate Accords, the Climate Change Committee, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and of course, COP. But these sorts of institutions, which are free from scrutiny and democratic accountability, always show the same problems. Bureaucratic groupthink, as they don't have to justify their decisions to a potentially cold and poor electorate. Perhaps even more importantly, the implicit premise behind them is that experts should make the important decisions and not democratically elected politicians. It's high time we reduce the powers of these institutions and reinforce the democratic ones. As always, I want to hear from you, mailmog@gbnews.com. Now, once again, I'm pleased to be joined by a friend of the programme, the director of the Climate Media Coalition, Donncha McCarthy. Donncha, thank you for coming in again.
Good evening, Jacob.
You and I have very different views on how climate change should be tackled, but do we at least agree that COP has become a ridiculous bean feast?
Well, COP has been meeting for 30 years to seek to tackle climate change, and every year it's met, the emissions have gone up. So clearly it's a failure. And the reason why it's a failure is because it's a UN body that has to include everybody. And so that means that we've got around 20 petro-dictatorships able to weaken the commitments and block any meaningful action being taken that will actually, in real terms, bring down carbon dioxide emissions.
And you've got 70,000 people going. What can they all be doing? How can they be involved?
Well, it's actually, it's just insane. The first COP had 2,000 people. This is 70. And they are not climate activists, Jacob, there. There are thousands of meat lobbyists, there are thousands of oil executives, there are thousands of airline executives trying to stop action behind the scenes. And what I would think would be brilliant is there's people who actually did with tobacco. A friend of mine was involved in the tobacco negotiations. How do we get an international agreement on banning advertising tobacco? And you know what the secret was? Get the lobbyists out of the room. Get the oil lobbyists out of COP and we might have an action.
Well, you see, I'm in strong agreement with you that it should be elected politicians who are meeting and discussing these things and then reporting back to their electorates. And if they have a mandate, they'll go your way or they'll go my way. But it will have a democratic mandate. What seems to happen here is you get an agreement written at the end that is heavily influenced by lobbyists, by big donors and all of those sorts of things that isn't achieving what either of us want.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talked about sovereignty, but actually COP has zero sovereignty. The 2015-2016 Paris Agreement, no legal mechanisms to implement it. And so what we've been seeing is governments go there, they make an agreement, Obama, Cameron, whatever, went to make the agreement. They came back and they didn't implement it because there's no legal mechanism.
Yeah, except we are taking steps. So yesterday, the House of Commons had a committee that put through the effective ban on petrol cars by 2030, which I know you would be in favour of, and I'm not. But this is coming from COP. It's coming from these agreements that emerge.
No, what's coming through Parliament is the pressure from the public to actually act. Look, Nigel, sorry. Sorry.
I'm not going to the jungle.
We're your stars. So what we're actually looking at this year is extraordinary science. I don't know if you've seen any of the graphs. What we climate activists have complained for years is scientists aren't using dramatic language. It's been very scientific, very geeky language. And we've been saying, please express it in the alarming terms that need. Scientists this year are saying they're terrified. They're looking at the hottest day ever in 125,000 years. We're looking at floods, food inflation, fires across the planet. And poor people in Britain are now paying the price. Because the ECIU said the inflation this year came from two sources, Jacob. First of all, food inflation due to extreme weather around the world. And secondly, inflation due to fossil fuel inflation. So we need to move ourselves off those for two reasons: to protect the future for the climate and to protect our food security.
But if you take the fossil fuel inflation, that's come because we haven't been maximising our own output. That if we had been fracking and doing things like that and hadn't made ourselves so dependent on the Russian dictatorship, the price of gas would not have gone up so much. And one of the main reasons for food inflation was the cutting off of supplies from Ukraine, which had a very strong effect on the cost of grains.
So two-thirds of the food inflation this year, you're correct, came from the fossil fuel inflation and from the Ukraine situation. However, in my local shop, there's a sign up saying, no olive oil until the new year. So Southern Europe has been experiencing what the climate scientists predicted 30 years ago, is that Southern Europe is beginning to desertify. And that is now impacting on massive fires, and the olive oil crop is in emergency.
But forest fires are something that's happened in nature since before mankind existed.
That's
and
true.
You've also had seasonal disruptions to crops. That again is something that we've been used to, and in some years in previous centuries you had famines in this country, let alone abroad. So this is part of how nature actually operates. You can't assume that there will always be a good harvest. It just doesn't work like that.
No, absolutely not. And Chatham House said, looking at current science, extreme weather events happen simultaneously in our food baskets, around 1 in every 1,000 years. And Chatham House, which I think, hopefully you agree, is a fairly respectable think tank, they now estimate by 2040s extreme weather events will be happening simultaneously in our food baskets. And then think through the consequence of that for poor people within food inflation, one of the worst inflation.
I'm going to ask you one final question, a very short answer. Do you think COP helps or hinders your campaigning?
It's a failure.
It's a failure. OK, there we go. Thank you to Donica. Coming up...